and then we're going to hear you read the first 30 words, and then we're going to start talking.
I hope you mean 30 lines.
30 lines, yes.
Okay.
30 letters. 30, yeah. Set in Toronto, Radioland takes us on a labyrinthine journey through the minds of two or maybe three very different characters. Jill, not her real name, has magical powers and makes money cleansing houses while distracting herself with drinking and chatting with Dzeko. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing his name right, who is a phantasm of her old therapist. After Jill pins a sign that says, "We will never meet, text only," to a tree, Kris, a Polaris prize-winning musician, sends her a text message. He is suddenly overwhelmed by life after horrific events from his childhood resurface. All the while, a third character, or is luring strangers to their deaths. Now the first 30 lines.
Look at me. Life as an adult is like a fever dream, but without the relief of knowing your parents are going to be there to comfort you when you wake up. This was the liminal space where his thoughts coalesced as he slipped between youths. A stockade of denim jackets and primped hair, rings and piercings, tats like semaphore, people pressing dully against him like livestock, tall and thick, oblivious to anyone nearby, other than those they chose to see. Their hearing blearied by music competing crosswise over their conversations, some with broad shoulders, some shorter, perfumed, arms outstretched with drinks threatening to spill on anyone passing through their undulating obstruction. That confidence, their presumptive immunity, revealing a more delicate and implicit trust. Fresh adults with unspoiled convictions and unarmed predilections. Amidst the bustling elbow to elbow, he made his way with little undertaking, holding his tumbler aloft to part through the crowd, eyes fixed on a couple in their early 20s he'd spotted earlier in the evening while he was perched at the bar, nodding quietly to anyone who might have recognized him. He understood he had a certain look, a certain reputation. It was not warm or welcoming, though strangely something about him glowed, and at a given moment he could send out a signal, send out a little hook. He slid past the guilty laughter of a shared joke between some boys wearing leathers on his left, snorting and giggling like they might as well have been in high school huddled by their lockers. How do you come this far lacking knowledge of certain truths? He affected interest in his phone as he followed the couple, taking interest in her growing exasperation with her partner, then casually sat himself at the bar across from the high top where they settled. She clearly didn't want to be there. All defeated sighs and rolling eyes, the kinds of things children do when they're unable to find the right words for how they feel or the depth to do so. He was patient, folding himself over slightly, taking up less space, fading into the background. The boyfriend didn't come across like a bully, but dressed the part, perhaps to compensate. The more time passed, the clearer it was to him that he was watching two outsized adolescents forced to be with one another, perhaps thanks to an interpretation of society's rules, that it was natural to stay together, but certainly not because it was best for them. And so they quietly chafed against another, checking their phones and looking to see if they knew anyone floating nearby. Neither one of them a good guy or bad guy, just two people coming apart together by virtue of being themselves. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's healthy. All these beautiful children, tasting freedom, displayed dimly under umber lamplight, how they sifted around each other with false certainty, their wallet chains and leather purses. He hoped the couple would come to a decision soon because his thoughts had become cloudy as of late, like the winking vignette used in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, closing in on a character's face as a scene faded to black. Darkness quietly imposed itself. He wasn't naive about what was changing inside, but a core part of him needed to retain clarity, It was clarity that was going to get him through to the next stage, though the life coach posers prescribed through, not around. A less patient part of him wanted to stand up as if directing a play and tell the young couple to stop being so sullen with one another. And sure enough, miracle of miracles, the boyfriend pulled his phone out of his jeans and within a few seconds of reading something, turned and shared a very cold remark with her and abruptly left. The prowler couldn't reach quickly enough through the room in that moment to sense what she'd been told, but his imagination filled in the blanks. We'll leave it there.
Awesome. I love that is the voice of the killer, which I thought was fantastic. The choice to open it with that I thought was brilliant, and the choice to extract them and have them exist on their own throughout, I thought was really great.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with the end of the book, only because I felt, first of all, I was kind of choked up when I read the acknowledgements. You and I share an emotional feeling about the pandemic, but it wasn't just the acknowledgements, and I would express to everyone to get the book, if not to just thoroughly enjoy the novel, but to read the acknowledgements. But the novel itself, or maybe specifically Jill or Kris, speak to a deep mistrust or fear of connecting, real human emotion, human connection, which I feel played into the pandemic. That's just my opinion. Kris and Jill never actually meet in real life, and I often wonder if part of what went down through the pandemic and part of what is happening in the novel, in this kind of pre-apocalyptic nightmare that we're living in, and that Jill and Kris are living in, is because we have such individualized experiences, we can't connect. And that part of Jill's magic, part of her wielding or fear of wielding, is her fear of connecting. And Kris is also desperately afraid of connecting, which I sort of felt is why he wanted to go out and do, have a solo career and do his own thing, because things with his girlfriend were just getting a little too. And I wanted to talk to you about that. I wanted to talk to you about that kind of emotional separateness.
I think connection is a big theme in my writing, and the lack thereof. And what happens to us when we don't feel the feedback, right? When we don't feel the feedback from the world around us, whether it be an individual we are close to or want to be close to, and how that can kind of have a distorting effect sometimes, how it can force us into isolation, particularly if we have that tendency to begin with. And I appreciate the note you're making too about it kind of hinting at the distorting effect that I think we all experienced during the lockdowns of the pandemic, necessary though they were. There were a lot of people who suffered from that lack of connection. And I think it's not lost on me that, there's an irony with Kris in that he's a musician. And so one would think that his sort of songwriting was kind of taking care of that work. But it's really, for him, I think, kind of a one-way street where even though he's reasonably successful, it's really hard to gauge or to know whether anyone out there is being sort of truly sort of touched, or whether it's just going through one ear and out the other. And with Jill, I think it's different insofar as, for her, it's about overcoming this overwhelming desire to be invisible, to not be seen, right?
Yeah. And her sort of realizing at one point in her life that, or questioning, I guess, not realizing, questioning whether or not she actually belonged in the life that she was living, I think kind of fed into her living as separately as she did. Was a great character study in her, for sure. I, of course, being a West End Toronto person, want to talk about Toronto. There's a lot of really, for me as a West Ender, a lot of like intimate scenes because I know very well Weston Village and all of the streets and neighborhoods mentioned in the novel. But at one point I thought it's either a brilliant choice for you to have this familiarity, which for a reader living in Toronto is immersive and kind of drags us in and hangs on to us tightly. But at the same time, for a reader outside of Toronto, has that kind of holding back because there is that real familiar assumption, I guess, of the streets. And I thought, okay, if Matt did this on purpose, that kind of push and pull with a Toronto reader and a non-Toronto reader, it's genius. But I'll let you talk about that. Did you think about readers, whether they were going to be in Toronto or outside of Toronto, when you were taking Jill and Kris down the streets?
Yeah, I'm always, I appreciate the insight. I'm always kind of taking the pulse of who's reading. And it's certainly, just like my previous book, The Society of Experience, a Toronto book, and I didn't want to pull any of that out of it. I think maybe less so now. There is sometimes a temptation to anonymize Canadian cities. Whereas if, we were picking up a book that took place in, say, Chicago or even Kansas, we would somehow, it's not an issue for us to kind of imagine what those streets look like or something. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to write with the familiarity that I have, but not in such an obscure sort of way where if you're sitting in Halifax or Red Deer reading this, that you're going to feel like you're somehow closed off from what's going on, I hope.
Okay. Yeah. No, it was definitely a familiar tour for me. And I totally agree with you. I can't even remember the novel I read. And it was that exactly, walking down the streets of Chicago, I think it was, and not knowing where I was and not being able to place myself in the city, but that the assumption was that I would, Google it or figure it out or just know. Yeah. The magical powers that Jill has, for the most part, it's not a gift so much as it's like a haunting, like an overwhelming, emotionally intense power that she herself can't trust. She's never quite sure whether what she's seeing is or feeling is real. Did she have, when you were sitting down to write Radioland, did she have magical powers from the start? Did you know that she was going to have something?
Yes, something, but I was very trepidatious even using the word magic. I think it's used quite sparingly because there's that word is almost inherently has a kind of a supernatural sort of aspect to it, whereas I wanted to approach it kind of like how, like, for example, David Cronenberg, we associate at least the first half of his career with making horror movies, and yet when you kind of pay attention, he is making horror movies from an atheistic perspective, where there are no ghosts, there are no demons, there are no witches, and I thought, if I'm going to go down this path and have a character who is able to use what you and I might call a form of magic, I thought, what would it be like if it was, say, biological, or if it was of this world, right? But just kind of more, I guess the word would be supranatural rather than supernatural, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I felt that separateness from religion that you just mentioned about Cronenberg, and now you've got me thinking about the fourth name of the other character in the book, and that's going to make me think a little more about that, I think. So the other thing that happens to Jill, and that happens to Kris as well, is that time disappears. Whether she's blacked out drunk and woken up the next morning, or whether she's disappeared into another world, she and Kris both feel this, what happened in the last period of time. And it does two things for me as a reader. One was it's a great tension mystery, like it builds the mystery in us really questioning who Jill and or Kris are. But it also spoke to, and you're talking about the kind of social realism, it also speaks to this mindlessness of human beings, right? That we can go through a day, we can go through a week, we can go through a month, and after that time passes, we look back and think, what the hell did I do this week? What did I do yesterday? What have I done this month? And not being able to recall, not being able to remember. And I wanted to talk to you about that. Was it what, I know that it fed into the mystery part of it, but was that anything that you thought about, that kind of mindlessness of time passing?
That's a good point, and I wanted to certainly express the way it's so easy for us to get stuck in our heads. We might call this self-absorption, or we might use other words, but particularly if we are going through a conundrum of sorts, it's easy for us to get sort of stuck in our heads, and suddenly we're losing time. And in this book, what happens around them while they are losing time is that people are murdered. Mm-hmm. And so it sort of obviously adds to this mystery of what's going on. But I do think it also sort of sometimes speaks to the way that we can sort of lose our anchoring in terms of, noticing time passing and our place in it, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. And that also speaks to what we talked about earlier, that connection, that idea that you miss connections, right? And at one point, Kris sends a text message to to Hera, or who he thinks is Hera, but he sent it to Jill. And, the idea of, I want to send a text message, but then it doesn't happen. And then text messages are sent and not answered. There's this throughout the novel, misconnection, this also not knowing, right? The experience that Kris had as a child and how it was developed through this false trust, this fake connection, this misunderstanding of love and affection, or not even that, if you want to talk about that. I thought was brilliantly played out in the structure of the novel. You've got so much of what is exposed to the reader in like text messages. What we learn about Kris and what we learn about Jill, in fact, happens mostly in text messages, like in the narrative exposition. What we know about them is what they say to each other. And I want to talk to you about that as a writerly choice, the decision to have these text messages really brought out, not in quotes, but really brought out of the narrative.
Yeah, I was kind of experimenting during the writing of the Site of Experience with a more, not quite an epistolary sort of format, but I think it allows us to get in quickly when we go from the sort of narrative structure of the book to a text where somebody, perhaps just because of the format of text itself, it's about the not just the brevity of communication, but getting to the point. And so I thought, it is kind of, for some people at least, wouldn't it be nice to just pick up your phone and just explain the mess of your life to someone who you don't know, who is yet somehow able to empathize and, in some respects, validate what it is that you're saying. And I think I certainly wanted to play with that.
Yeah, and that again, I keep going back to this connection, which is that's not the only thing I got out of the book, but again, this idea that we are so afraid of human connection that Kris and Jill both are able to express their true feelings, their true what the hell's going on in my life to a perfect stranger, but not to anyone else. And it's not till the
Yes.
end of the novel that Kris is able to say the words out loud to a real life person.
Yes. And yeah, it's funny how much it can take for us to have it out with someone who we know, and to really let them in, truly let them in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's beautiful. That's my big thing about uh, expressing to everyone watching this that you should read this novel is that you really get that feeling of what we're losing as humans by missing connections or not looking for connections and not um, massaging those connections and caring for them in a way.
I think there's certainly a feeling that it's very difficult to sustain community in a time where, even though social media provides certainly advantages, it can also it can lead to a kind of an atomization of people. So it certainly does touch on that as well, I hope.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Because social media sometimes does the opposite, right? The willingness to share personal truths to a perfect stranger is also the willingness to say the most vile, inhumane, unspeakable words to a perfect stranger. Yeah. Okay, so
Absolutely.
now this is a writerly thing, and again, part of the reason why I wanted to have this reading series is to really think about writing. You paced so perfectly the mystery. You unfolded, you revealed, you kept back, you continued forward in such a perfectly paced way. My first thought was, okay, you must have plotted this out. You must have really thought about how you were going to unveil all of this. So my question is, did you just sit down and write this, or did you really think about plot and when you were going to share and when scenes were going to be played?
I think the first draft was certainly more condensed, and I think the general plot points were in place. But I'll be honest with you, I didn't actually add the sort of prowler slash serial killer chapters until the sort of second draft, where it felt like we really needed the not just the shadow of that person's presence, but to inhabit that person and see through their eyes. I really appreciate your points on the pacing, and I'm happy that it was successful and that you enjoyed it to that degree.
Mm-hmm. I did. It was really, I mean, so much so that I was battling between that, is this a human story or is it a mystery? And how brilliantly it becomes both is really great. I'm super impressed. Um, I mentioned earlier the fourth name of a character in the book, and I mentioned earlier that Jill is not her, it's not actually her name. And Kris talks about names quite often, names of bands, and I want to talk to you about names. I want to talk to you about the complication of naming characters, but also the added complication of how you talk about names, how you talk about labels, and how people are addressed, or who they think they are, I guess is probably more accurate, who they think they are.
Yeah, we can step into names and and sort of like robes and personas. And, anyone tuning into this could go out right now and go to a coffee shop or a pub or a library and introduce yourself as someone else. And nobody you're speaking with is going to have any expectation other than what it is that you present. And boy, if you're not in a good place, that could be, among other things, transformational for someone to be able to step into another type of person, particularly if you don't like the person who you are.
Yeah.
But of course, the danger there is of becoming so unmoored from who you actually are that it can, lead to instability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a feeling that I had about that um, person, unnamed person. Um, so next I want to talk about structure, because I just tend to always ask about structure, and it's the most fascinating thing to me. I always have a really difficult time thinking about whether to structure a novel with chapters or titles, and I'm always impressed when I read a novel that's got chapters that are titles, like quotes from songs or stuff like that. You've got the novel told in 3 parts. Each of the parts have a title, and then throughout the rest we've got just the names of the characters as we move from perspective to perspective. And I want to talk to you about that structure. Was that something you knew from the start, or was it developed?
The 3 parts, I think, were more or less there in the first draft, and so were intentional. It wasn't until working with the publisher that it was, I felt, with some nudging from readers, that it would probably be best, for sake of clarity, for the chapters to have the character name above them. I really, 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 really didn't want to do that. I was really hoping that the style of each person's sort of first person narrative would clue the reader in. But I think it probably just ended up being too much work on the reader's behalf if that were the case. So that's what happened in the editorial process, and I have no regrets about that, because, quite frankly, it's all about the reader. It's all about clarity, and it's all about helping the reader just keep moving along, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I can definitely see in those times through the novel, through the story, where Kris and Jill are kind of going through a similar kind of emotional experience, that it would be difficult. But yeah, I guess I get that. It's to make the job of reading as easy as possible. But I also like that idea of yours of untitling them. But anyway, it's
We
gorgeous.
can all dream.
Gorgeous the way it is. So that's it. Okay, this is my last question, and I think we have time because I feel like we started a little bit later. So anyway, I'll ask this quickly. You said in an interview that you wrote 1,000 words a week of the new novel that I'm hoping you're in the middle of revising and that we're going to see at some point in time. And I wanted to talk to you about that. Does the new novel share common themes, as you've described as metaphysical social realism? And at what point are you in the novel?
I'm really excited about the new novel. I wrote it during the first year of the pandemic, and I, you know, typically when I've written, it's here and there whenever I can. Obviously, because of the lockdown, I, didn't have a lot of plans on the weekend.
Right.
So I told myself, let's just do at least 1,000 words. And, that way it might have seemed arbitrary, but it actually was really effective.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly not to give anything away, but it's actually more satirical and humorous of a book. So that for me was very intriguing. However, it is very much concerned with communication and with a character's search for, some sort of truth or meaning through that medium. And I am currently attempting what I hope is the last round of substantive rewrites, and then I will pass that off to my agent and hope for the best.
Right. That's awesome. I hope for the best too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for talking to me about Radioland today. Gorgeous cover, by the way. For some reason, I can't see who's joined us. I really, really hope that I didn't mess something up with this Instagram Live. Normally, I see people joining and doing stuff, but I can't right now. So I hope I didn't mess it up. Thank you.
I'm sure it'll be fine.
Thank you again. Best of luck with the new book, and I hope anyone who's watching will go out and grab yourself a copy of Radioland. You can buy it directly from Wolsak Wynn. They have a bookstore on their website, and you can find out more about Matt at www.mattcahill.ca. That's it.
Thank you, Allison. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Take care.